Hello there, and welcome to this Ramadan Conversations. We're all in this together. It's presented by the Affinity Intercultural Foundation of Australia. I'm John Cleary, and I'll be hosting this series of conversations presented throughout Ramadan. Ramadan is, of course, characterised by the iftar meal, the breaking of bread amongst friends and neighbours. And this year, as COVID-19 has made that impossible, so Affinity has decided to carry Ramadan to an online world, a virtual iftar, if you like. Ramadan Conversations is a daily 1-hour live virtual iftar. Each episode will be live streamed and later available for download on Affinity's YouTube page. And as a former ABC broadcaster with a special interest in religion, it's my great pleasure to host these conversations together with a number of assistant hosts drawn from the Muslim community. Tonight, we're joined by Dr Mehmet Aslan. Mehmet received his PhD in education from the University of Western Sydney, and he's currently the Community Engagement Manager at Pinnacle College in Adelaide, in South Australia. It's the sister school of Sydney's Amity College. And he's also an honorary fellow in the School of Humanities and Social Inquiry at the University of Wollongong. Mehmet, great to meet you.
Thank you, John. Thank you for having me.
Mehmet, as the community leader at Pinnacle College, how has this extraordinary season of COVID-19 affected the way you engage in community? In what ways were you able to, for instance, keep community relations going based in a school during a crisis like this?
Yeah, it has affected our college, Pinnacle College, and but in spite of that, Pinnacle College is committed to ensuring continuity of learning for all students as a result of this pandemic and also other critical incidents aboard. And for the last 2 weeks, we have been providing, we have been using and providing CISO and Google Classroom activities. Google Classroom. Actually, we started these online tools last term when the case has escalated, but it's just online. So as of term 2, so last week, up until last week, we were catering for both online and face-to-face teaching. Since, after that, as of week, over a third of our students returned back to school. So, and I guess things are improving, getting better in South Australia in terms of number of cases and mobility. And you see that most of the shops are open, and people, people are trying to socialize, at different levels. And so also as a community and school, we decided to organize Ramadan hampers for our school parents, teaching and non-teaching staff, as well as community leaders. The Ramadan hampers have been organized by the community engagement and pastoral care teams. And today we started to deliver these hampers, and even myself, I delivered more than 25 hampers. So that means it more than 5 families. So and knocking at the door and saying hello, and families were surprised. On a positive note. So I'm sure, especially when parents, will be delighted to receive these gifts, wonderful gift, especially when it is delivered to them by the management team and teachers. So I think it's a nice gesture to our parents, and it shows that how much we value them, and we are thinking about them, particularly in these challenging times. So
it's a very concrete expression of community. Yeah, and the fact that it's practical is so important too. We must move on. We'll get a chance to come back on some of those questions a little later on. Before we introduce our special guests for this evening, we've pleasure to begin this program with a special Ramadan message from the Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Scott Morrison.
Ramadan is a time of special devotion for those of the Muslim faith. It's a time for fasting and for prayer, a time for reflection and renewal. But this year, Ramadan in Australia, like in so many places around the world, will be very different. The coronavirus means this Ramadan will be spent at home. Like you, I wish the mosques were open and the places of worship were open during these holy times. But I assure you, there will come a day when that will be the case again. And it will be a very joyous day when people of faith can gather together and worship. A day to celebrate our freedoms as Australians, whatever our faith may be. But until then, all of us, from every faith, and those from none, of course, all must play our part in our efforts to fight this coronavirus, to maintain that social distancing and to look out for each other. And I want to thank all of those who are doing exactly that right across Australia. We are all in this together, regardless of our background, regardless of our faith. I know it's not easy, but my hope is that Muslims across Australia at this time will draw strength from their faith, from their homes and their families and their community, and draw strength from the fact that they are in a body of people that look out for each other. I want to thank the Muslim community right across Australia for everything you have been doing and the great example you have been setting and the leadership provided in your community. As you enter this month-long period of Ramadan, I hope it is a deeply meaningful time for you and a time to renew under a time of great challenge, a time to pray and support each other as we see this crisis through. Ramadan Kareem.
Authorised by S. Morrison, Liberal Party, Canberra.
The Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, with that special message for Ramadan. So, Mehmet, it's time to turn to the first of our guests for this evening. The Honourable Jing Lee MLC is Assistant Minister to the Premier of South Australia. Jing currently holds the position of Assistant Minister to Premier Stephen Marshall. Prior to entering Parliament, Jing was a businesswoman with over 20 years of management and international trade experience. Over that time, she worked across the region in Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong and China. Jing is an active advocate for multiculturalism. Jing Lee, welcome to this Ramadan conversation.
Hello, John. Hello, Dr. Aslan. Assalamu alaikum.
Jing, you are proud to be the first Malaysian-born Chinese migrant elected to the State Parliament of South Australia. What did it mean for you, particularly in regard to your ongoing commitment to multiculturalism?
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me today on your program. I think when we talk about pride, to be the first Malaysian migrant to be elected in Parliament, that pride doesn't just come from myself or my family. I think it's a pride that carry from all the multicultural communities, particularly first migrant. I'm a migrant, I'm a daughter of a migrant. I'm also a first migrant because I came here with my family in 1979. So what it means in terms of enriching our state and our beloved country, New Australia, is that everybody comes together. And I think this particular conversation about during Ramadan is one that is really, really important to have.
The Muslim community has a long and proud history in South Australia, in particular, going back to the days of the Afghan Cameleers who helped open up the way north of the state with the overland telegraph and then later the railway. Yet the growth of the Islamic community over the past 20 years has seen some stresses emerging. Adelaide, for example, was long known as the city of churches. From your personal and political experience, how have South Australians adjusted to becoming a much broader multi-faith community?
I think we are very lucky in South Australia that we do recognise multicultural and multi-faith and diversity and also interculturalism. Because when we talk about interculturalism, it's not just accepting that people are different from us, but it's about accepting that people are, you know, from the communities that we can share common interests, vision, that we can live together in harmony, that we embrace each other's culture broadly. That includes celebrating Ramadan, even though like we're not Muslims, but we are sharing it with our beloved brothers and sisters from a different faith. And we cherish that deeply. I mean, this year, because of COVID-19, we are unable to spend time together, you know, like you mentioned earlier in your opening, the many, many iftar, the breaking fast, prayers and ceremonies. We can't be together in terms of in one place, but we certainly are together in our hearts, in our minds, and spiritually together.
Mehmet.
Yes, my question would be, Honorable Jing Lee, the impact of COVID-19 has provided a trigger for the re-emergence of some anti-immigrant and even racist sentiments across the board. I mean, across the world, including Australia. The Chinese community have been singled out through the link to Wuhan as a city from which the virus emerged. So, what would be your response?
It's actually terrible and devastating to see that fellow Australians will attack another fellow Australian based on race. It's totally unacceptable. And it's not just for Chinese community, predominantly it's targeting towards Chinese community. But if somebody look remotely like Chinese, and I have heard stories from the Thai community, Vietnamese community, Cambodian community, if you remotely, you know, I think it's Australian Asian or Asian Australians that have been also, has been unfairly and been discriminated as well. And that's really, really sad. But may I say this though, I have actually have a Say No to Racism survey currently running, and just to also encourage communities who've been mistreated and who have harm done to them to report to SAPO, our South Australian Police, immediately. Because we do have the Equal Opportunity Act, we have the Racial Vilification Act in South Australia that will protect individuals from harm and from hate crime and all those things. But let me sort of reassure the community that I spoke to SAPO, the South Australian Police, and the Minister for Police only 2 weeks ago, and they have reassured me that they have not increased reporting of crime against them in terms of racism that's caused by racism alone. So I often say to community leaders this: while racism, particularly caused or affected by coronavirus, is real, we in South Australia are not as prevalent, if you like, compared to other states. We have them, but we don't have this aggression, if you like. And this is when our multicultural community stand together, not just because, oh, look, you know, it's time now to pick on Chinese or pick on an Asian face because of coronavirus, because the virus itself does not discriminate. It, as we already know, now millions of people around the world, it doesn't matter whether you are, American, Spanish, Italian, Chinese, Malaysian, Singaporean, it doesn't matter which country is across the world, millions of them have been impacted. But in South Australia, I'm pretty proud to say we have been, able to stick together as one community. We are able to call out racism as it is and fight together and stand with everybody.
Jing Lee, as COVID-19 has impacted community life, so it must have impacted enormously the life of working politicians. I can imagine the Premier's office must have been turned upside down by this sort of stress, a sort of a daily rolling cabinet meeting, I imagine. But how's it affected life for you around your working life and then flowing onto your family life?
This we see now is a part of, the impact of coronavirus. Otherwise, I'll be having a face-to-face meeting with leaders and yourself. It has certainly impacted on our life. People think that this is a downtime. Oh, don't believe them. I've been working longer hours, 7 days a week, because there's so much like news and a lot of anxiety, fear, anguish out there across the different communities. They want to know when are we going to get better? When can we open our mosques and places for business? How can we get funding for this or that to get us through really difficult times? So you are correct, absolutely, John. Department of Premiers and Cabinet, the Department of Health, police, everybody has been working 24/7. In terms of Parliament, South Australia is probably the only parliament really has not really taken that many days off. We have resumed Parliament, but we have kept the 1.5 meters social distancing rule. We arrange our sitting arrangement to cater for legislation that needs to be passed. We continue to work tirelessly for our community, because we know that if we work hard, if we are able to get the message, the communication across to our wider community, we'll be able to keep everybody calm. And let me tell you, John, if you haven't followed about our news recently, we are now have been consecutive days, 0 new cases. We're down to one remaining active case of coronavirus in South Australia. And so I want to use this opportunity for those listeners that are from South Australia, how proud we are and how grateful we are to our health heroes out there. Anyone that is from the front lines, hospital staff, to ambulance services, to SAPO officers who've done the tracing, assay pathology for numerous testing that they have done every single day. We are indebted to your service and sacrifices that you've made, because all the frontline workers, they have to probably stay away from their family, because they are, particularly those that work in ICU, because there's a lot of risk involved. But, we have been punching above our weight. Sorry, John, I'm very, Adelaidean and South Australian.
We'll permit you. We'll permit you this moment of indulgence. South Australia, like all communities, is in part also sustained by a network of civil society groups, from religious groups to sporting clubs, charitable organisations, most of those maintained by volunteers. COVID-19 has seen them much of their activity curtailed. Some groups may even have to close. Yet these are the very groups that could prove vital in rebuilding community and business life as society reopens. So how is the government handling this? Is the government preparing to support these sorts of community groups as the lockdown lifts?
We actually, ever since the COVID-19 restrictions have been imposed, you're right that many community groups have to shut their door, However, we, instead of those essential services like food bank, Meals on Wheels, Red Cross, Salvation Army, we've continued to provide extra boost of funding for them to carry out their services. Working together with our federal government of Department of Social Services, the Department of Human Services in South Australia have been able to inject more funding. In terms of the multicultural community, we have been able to transfer many of the multicultural grants into COVID outreach program, meaning many of the volunteers-based organization is able to access funding up to $10,000 per organization, where they can invest that money into software, in online platform of delivery. We also able to help them to manage a volunteer space, so that in terms of collecting hampers, hygiene products, even masks, PPE, those sort of equipment is available to very vulnerable communities that need those hampers or food products to sustain them, because they are the most vulnerable communities impacted. Some of them lost their jobs. Many of the older senior people unable to get to families, and so we have volunteers still continue to do the essential services out there.
Mehmet, perhaps a final question from yourself.
Yes, with the COVID-19, unfortunately, humanity is facing one of the most serious crises and challenging times in recent history. And there are some predictions that nothing will be the same after this pandemic, with society, the role of governments, the economy undergoing significant change. I mean, across the world. So COVID-19 has also had a major impact on the Muslim month of Ramadan. So the tradition of iftar meals and share with friends and neighbors has been suspended, unfortunately. So a view on the role of such activities, or such multi-faith community activities.
In South Australia today marks the beginning of step one of the road to recovery. And we are looking at easing the restrictions more and more, so that communities can still be together. Obviously, today means that some of the mosque activities, not in big numbers, but up to 10 people, maximum 10 people, can actually pray at mosque and have iftar dinner if you wish, but it has to be restricted to up to 10 people. And the density requirement, the golden rule, is 1 person per 4 square meters. Now, this is only the first step, the first tranche, if you like, of the ease of restriction. South Australia has been very different. We operate a bit different to the other states, because when other states only have a restriction of up to 2 people, we actually never have a full lockdown. We're able to have family members or community members up to 10, for picnic and all those things that can still carry out in South Australia. And today mark that opening, if you like, to community groups, community halls, mosques, places of worship, and youth centers. If you want to carry workshop for young people as well as for seniors, you can do so, but the restriction is 10 people. That's just the beginning. And I think even though we can't be together, some of the outreach program through digital platform, through call centers, the ability to still maintain connection without the face-to-face, in terms of, because of social distancing, that can still reach out to communities to allow them to think that they're not alone in this crisis, that we are here to support them.
Jing Lee, an appropriate point to end this conversation. Thank you so much for giving us your time today, and thanks for all you're doing.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Dr. Aslan, for everything you do.
Thank you, Honorable Jing.
Well, Mehmet, our second guest tonight is Dr Nadeem Memon, a Senior Research Fellow in the Centre for Islamic Thought and Education in the School of Education at the University of South Australia. His research focuses on teacher education with a particular emphasis on comparative faith-based schooling. Prior to moving to South Australia, Nadeem was the Director of Education at Razi Education, a Canadian education consulting firm focused on professional development for educators working in Western school contexts with significant Muslim student populations. Nadeem, welcome to this Ramadan conversation.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, Dr. Nadeem.
Thank you, Mehmet.
Yes, John?
Yes, you have a question, Mehmet, I believe.
Yes, yeah, I have a question. Dr. Nadeem, your doctoral dissertation focused on the history and philosophy of Islamic in North America. How did you decide to specialize, particularly in the field of religious education? And what were your initial aims when you started this career?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting journey. Very similar to the Australian context. The Canadian context is highly diverse, religiously diverse, and there are significant teacher education programs for other faith communities in Canada and the United States, which really piqued my interest. You have many universities that have Catholic teacher education programs. You have a number of universities that have Jewish teacher education programs, and a rise in Indigenous Aboriginal teacher education as well. And with the growth of Islamic schooling globally, but in particular in North America and Australia, in the UK, I began to realize there's a dire need. A need to think through what it means to educate from an Islamic perspective, just like you would from a different faith-based perspective. And this need got me thinking about teacher education from within the Islamic tradition, and began an entire research journey around this concept of Islamic pedagogy, which has been carrying me forward for the past 15 odd years.
It's an extraordinarily important area. You've published a book, Discipline, Devotion and Dissent, Jewish, Catholic and Islamic Schooling in Canada. Now, each one of these Abrahamic traditions has both strong cultural and theological strands. And for educators, I guess that can be problematic, to disentangle the essential doctrinal and theological truths from the culture in which they've become embedded. And this can be an especially difficult challenge for immigrant communities and their educators, where many of the immigrants want to hang on to their culture as much as they do to their faith. And it's a difficult problem for that second generation, the young people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Identity, I think, the sense of shared identity that you mentioned, John, between being Muslim and being Australian, being Muslim and being Canadian, or Jewish and American, and so on. This shared identity is something that is an essential component of faith-based schooling. I think part of this is, at least from the perspective of Islamic schools, many Muslim families that were part of establishing the early Islamic schools here in Australia, but similarly in the UK and similarly in North America, did so for the preservation of both their cultural and their religious identity. They felt that it was essential to have a school ethos where your religious values are reinforced holistically, not just as an academic subject of religious studies, not just as an appendage to a curriculum in a public or state school, but to have an entire school ethos that reflects the values of that faith tradition. And I think that I don't think we're necessarily achieving what we envision to achieve, but that's part of the struggle. That's part of the experience. And I think for many of our schools, it's part of the growing pains of trying to define an education system that that does what we aspire for.
Many of those, all of those traditions have elements which move from liberal and progressive to conservative and some extremely conservative. And each of those traditions is reflected in different schooling structures. I mean, how do you teach, for example, secular subjects such as biological science and evolution to conservative religious traditions? And I'm here speaking about Christian traditions, Jewish traditions, Islamic traditions. Conservative faith-based schools that seem to only allow for a literal reading based on the interpretation of the particular tradition that that school belongs to. I remember, for instance, in my own experience, there was a BBC TV series broadcast many years ago called The Long Search. It featured a discussion with a rabbi at a yeshiva, and the interviewer asked him, "Do you believe the Torah is the word of God?" "Of course we do," replied the rabbi. Then why do you have all these students debating about the text?" "My boy," said the rabbi, "we believe the Torah is the word of God. What we argue about is what he meant when he said it." Now that's a continuing challenge for educationalists, is it not?
Absolutely. But I think that, John, the point that you brought up about the diversities within a faith tradition are very important. And this is one of the challenges that I think, at least in the Islamic schooling sector, we are now experiencing, which is it's a simple truth. All Muslims are not the same. All Christians are not the same. All Jews are not the same. We're not going to practice the faith the same way. We're not going to approach the faith the same way. And we don't all have the same theological perspectives or orientations. And similarly, the challenge that we're now experiencing in Islamic schools is exactly around that complexity. Is when you have a theological position, like the one you mentioned, on biological sciences, for example, and everyone doesn't agree, what are you going to do? And part of this challenge is beginning to say, how do we unpack the complexities within our faith tradition in an assumed context where we all have the same belief? We go on the assumption that we all do when we don't. We have our core beliefs and values, but at the same time, the way that interacts with contemporary issues will be very different. So I think these are the types of conversations that make faith-based schooling so complex and interesting, but necessary. And sorry, to your point about from the progressive to the conservative, I just want to point out, not every faith-based school would be of the conservative leaning. Not every goes to a public faith school, public state school would feel a more sort of liberal perspective on Islam. So the range of complexity exists in both contexts.
Yeah, yeah. Mehmet.
Yes, my next question is that COVID-19 is an enormous impact on school-based learning worldwide. How do you think it may change teaching practice in the future? And could this mean a loss of much of the experience of school as life building through teamwork and cooperation?
Well, I think, if anything, COVID-19, for those of us that have been lucky enough to not be affected in a way that's been traumatic. I mean, I think first we need to acknowledge that COVID-19 has affected all of us in very different ways. Some of us have lost loved ones, and some of us have been affected by COVID directly, and others haven't been touched by it, and life has gone on. So it really depends on how we've experienced it. But if we go on the assumption that that somebody has not been affected in a way that has caused an undue amount of hardship on them, then I think for those folks, COVID-19 is an opportunity, and it's an opportunity in terms of schooling to think differently. For many families, if they've had the opportunity, it's given them more time with their families, with their children. For those educators that are connecting in more creative ways online, I'm hearing all types of stories of things that are happening that you wouldn't necessarily have a chance to do in school. You have young people that are doing practical, everyday things around the house. You have young people who are gardening. You have young people who are, helping their fathers fix the car. There's all types of things that are happening that are far more sort of hands-on, everyday, experiential opportunities that you don't always get when you're so focused on the academics of school. So to answer your question directly, Dr. Mehmet, I feel that COVID, for some of us, has been an opportunity to rethink schooling and to rethink what learning can potentially be.
What are,
John,
let's, yes, Mehmet, yes.
one more question. Yes. Dr. Nadeem, you also work closely with Professor Muhammad Abdullah at the Center for Islamic Thought and Education. As you know, Professor Abdullah is the founder of Center for Islamic Thought and Education at the University of South Australia. Can you please tell us about the center? I mean, how it was established and what do you offer? Can you please enlighten us about its programs?
Sorry, Dr. Mehmet, I didn't quite get your full question. I'm not sure if it's my connection but could you maybe just repeat the question?
Yes, you also work closely with Professor Muhammad Abdullah at the Center for Islamic Thought and Education. Professor Abdullah is the founder of Center for Islamic Thought and Education at the University of South Australia. So can you please tell us about the center? I mean, how it was established and what do you offer? I mean, what sort of programs do you offer?
Yeah, the center that is directed by Professor Muhammad Abdullah is actually a quite unique opportunity, I think, for us as an Australian community, both Muslim and those who don't identify as Muslim, because the center focuses on three large buckets: research, teaching, and engagement. And within those has a focus on serving the discourse around contemporary Muslim thought, contemporary Islamic thought. And we have two major programs. One is a minor in Islamic studies that addresses contemporary issues in Islamic studies. And the second, which I'm involved in with some of my colleagues, which is a graduate certificate in Islamic education, or a graduate certificate in education with a focus on Islamic education. The focus of the latter program is very similar to a Catholic teacher education program that all educators who go to Catholic schools, who work in Catholic schools, would complete. We don't have a program like that, an accredited teacher education program for Islamic schools globally. And this is really a first of its kind that provides an opportunity for deep discussions in education about the Islamic tradition in relation to education, and what that implies for the way that we run our Islamic schools, the way that we teach and engage and develop curriculum in our Islamic schools.
Nadeem Memon, just a final, more comforting question. I think Ramadan the world this year is rather different. But from your time in the USA and Canada, have you noticed any differences in customs or tweaking of the way the whole month is lived out nationally? I mean, are there differences, all subtle, in Canada, the USA, Australia that you've noticed?
I mean, between my experience, it's been very similar. The transition to being in Australia and Adelaide in particular has been very, very welcoming. I find that the Muslim community has a very similar rhythm as I would expect in North America. Probably the biggest challenge has been adjusting to the time zone and the shifts in time of year. But generally, you know, it's Adelaide in particular has a very warm and welcoming, relatively small Muslim community in comparison to places like Sydney and Melbourne. But my experience has been extremely smooth, and I feel like I've just picked up where I left off.
Well, it's been wonderful to have you with us tonight. Thanks for the insight into your understandings of Muslim education. Dr. Nadeem Memon, we wish you well, and thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Thank you, Dr. for joining us.
Well, now, Mehmet, we've time for a musical interlude. It's from Melbourne, once again, in the Sufi tradition, Salih Reshitoglu.
Hello, once again. Tonight I will play Nihavent, an scale Nihavent, called Aşkın ile Aşıklar Yansın, May I Burn With You Love. This is a poem by Yunus Emre again, and composed by Doğan Ergin. Here we go.
Salih, that was wonderful. Salih Reshitoglu. Mehmet Aslan, I should perhaps ask someone to unpick the Sufi tradition in music for us. It's such a wonderful and rich tradition.
Yes, it is, John. I mean, I like it. And I always listen to Sufi music. I mean, it's very relaxing.
Well, it's time now, having that moment of relaxation, to meet our final guest. Our final guest tonight is Dr Mahsheed Ansari. Dr Ansari is a lecturer in Islam and Contemporary Islamic Studies at the Centre for Islamic Studies and Civilization at Charles Sturt University. Her PhD is in Historical and Islamic Studies from Monash University and focused on the work of Syed Nursi and Muhammad Iqbal. As a historian, she's interested in the migration, settlement, formation and development of Muslim communities as minority communities in Australia. She's also a community activist working in the areas of interfaith dialogue, social harmony and leadership mentoring programs with Muslim youth and Muslim women for over a decade. Mahsheed, welcome to this Ramadan conversation.
Thank you, John. It's wonderful to be there with you here online and with Mehmet. Thank you for that introduction.
Mahsheed, we're expecting a very different Ramadan this year. We've lost some of the community sense of the iftar meal, but perhaps we've recovered something through a renewed emphasis on the fast and on personal reflection. How's it been for you?
Well, John, as you said, it has been a different Ramadan for me as well. Just before the Ramadan, I was talking with a friend, James Valentine, as well. And I was telling him, James, I don't think this Ramadan I'm going to enjoy the hospitality that, is often celebrated, as you know, with the iftar meals. And I said to him, my social calendar is going to be a little bit less busy this year. But of course, it hasn't been. I have been had a lot of online programs, which has been equally fulfilling. But I think it has given me a space and a needed opportunity to have a bit of a different Ramadan this year. I've had opportunities to perhaps not be so social with friends and family as I used to be, but it allowed me to go a little bit deeper into the deeper aspects of fasting, which is taking it just beyond the abstinence of food and drink and water, but to the meaning and reconnecting with the divine, questioning my existential, philosophical dilemmas that face all of us in this pandemic. It has been a useful, really, time for me to use it for self-reflection, which I hope, and I'm still hoping to utilize more. And also it's made me realize the internalization of the loneliness that our nation is experiencing. My husband's been working long hours still, despite the Ramadan, and I've had some meals on my own. And I began to internalize the pain of the growing suffering of our lonely nation. And I think this is the greater pandemic as Australians and as humanity that faces us. It's made me realize that a lot more this Ramadan.
Dr Mehmet Aslan, you've got an observation.
Yes, Dr. Mahsheed, thank you for joining us. Ramadan is a key month in our calendar, and it's also one in which the iftar provides a great opportunity to share our values. How important are such opportunities in building interfaith and intercultural understanding in the wider community?
Thank you, Mehmet. Well, as you know, and as John knows as well, you guys are doing such fantastic work with these online forums for really still bringing our community together in this COVID time. But having been a witness to these iftars, I can say that over the years, not just these, but other dialogue efforts have really significantly contributed to our social harmony, increasing social cohesion for our multicultural nation. But of course, and they have momentarily suspended the tensions, the party politics and all of that, and really brought about conversations that have been useful. I can testify that in Sydney alone, in the last 20 years, we really have come a long way. But having said that, it has been nevertheless still a small step towards overcoming what I would say some deeper challenges that we face as a nation, and that we still have a lot of work to do. But the racial tensions that sometimes resurge, hatred and violence, I think can be overcome if we have greater emphasis on, and of course have more support from the infrastructure of our society, from different sectors in our society, so that it's not just you and I, John, and other members, which I think Affinity and other dialogue centres in our nation have really contributed to this fellowship and mateship. And I'm hopeful that we can continue the pattern forward.
One of your specialities is the work of Syed Nursi and Muhammad Iqbal. Now, both were key Islamic thinkers in the emergence of modern Islamic thought, in coming to terms with modernity and the West. Syed Nursi, in particular, had a huge influence in Turkey, right up to and including the recent political troubles. What's his continuing significance?
Thanks, John. Hardly anybody asked me about my PhD thesis, which I completed a couple of years ago now, but I'm so excited that I'm looking forward for my book coming out on that soon. But Iqbal and Nursi, as you said, have really had an impact on the Islamic world. And I'd like to highlight that they're from the non-Arabic speaking Islamic world as well, you know, from India and the subcontinent where Iqbal was from, and Nursi from Anatolia. So this is also an interesting comparison that I sort of bring in from that research. Nursi, of course, has had laid the foundations of a textual community because of his major works, the Risale-i-Nur in Anatolia, just before Turkey, the Republic, was established. And of course, when it was established, the people overnight were cut off from their language, from their alphabet, and from this Quran itself. So it became sort of like a secret, hidden society because of the, sadly, because of the quite oppressive sort of policies that were there. They're a little bit like the early Christians were persecuted by the Romans and they entered the cave, you know, the people of the cave. They're a little bit like that, the community. And of course, sociologists and scholars today, when we analyse Nursi's work and role in the formation of modern Turkey, we can see that he, as a civic movement, the contribution has been great that his text-based community has contributed to. And the Nur movement, which he inspired, of course, had a great impact in mobilising the middle class in Turkey, and they were a bit of the more religious sector. And that creating of that religious consciousness that was trying to be eroded by modernity was really what I would argue, would be his biggest contribution. So I'm no expert in Turkish politics today, but I can certainly comment on Nursi's philosophical and theological works. We see these from time to time in various contexts, whenever the freedoms of speech and intellect and practice of religion are taken away. These are abuses of course, independence and that need to be restored. So Nursi, in short, I'd say, it still has an impact, not just in Anatolia, but now as his work's being translated around the world.
Mehmet.
Dr. Mahsheed, modernity itself has also proved a challenge for many conservative religious traditions across the world. And we have seen the rise of religiously linked conservative nationalism, be it Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Muslim, or Hinduism. So at the moment, those forces seem to be on the rise globally. So what are the elements driving this at this global age?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, this is a major problem, Dr. Mehmet, that, you know, we're facing sadly as a humanity. And I would argue that the good vehicle of religion is being used and abused by various factions in society, by once again, and even modernity itself, I would argue, has stripped religion of its much, ancient ability to influence, tradition to influence human beings, individuals, families, and communities. And that negatively has affected the transformative nature or effect that a religion can have on an individual, again, by making it almost like a commodity. It's reduced religion to some power play between various segments in society. And this is what really is the greatest challenge facing all world religious traditions today. What I think we need to do, in short, it's a long discussion and there's books and literature that's coming out on this area. We need to revisit and go back to the universal principles and what they actually offer us, these ancient wisdoms. And despite the differences in all of our religious traditions, there's much commonality, and a lot of them preach, brotherhood and unity and we really need to regain and reclaim religion back in the hands of and its true ownership. And sadly, the modern world has reflected its own power-hungry, greedy face and blemished face, and blemished the faith of religion as well, in short.
Your recent research also looks at minority histories in Australia, focusing on Muslim history. Now, there's been a tendency to view Australian history as largely an Anglo journey, commencing with Captain Cook and climaxing with the Kokoda track. It's only in the last 20 years we've begun to take our own Aboriginal heritage seriously. Now there are so many strands to our multi-faith cultural history. It must be a huge challenge to weave these into our educational structures and produce some sort of coherent sense of identity.
Absolutely, John. Thank you for this question. Look, it's such an important question. It is a difficult task weaving it in. However, there are so many scholars, academics, historians who are ready to embark on this journey, because history really is, in the hands of the powerful, as we know. So I think much of our national history, of Australian history, it's also the mindset that we've had. And as you said earlier this evening, as you quoted the Camelees, we cannot negate, when we look at our historical events, objectively, the significance of all communities, including minority communities. So it's not like we need to introduce a new sort of curriculum, but it's more acknowledging and looking at the significance and the contribution of minority communities like the Muslim community. You mentioned the Camelees, of course, in setting up of central, Australia, opening up Australia really, but also of the Chinese, the Italians, the Greeks, and right up until the 70s and 80s when we opened up our economy in our country to all these different nations, and through labour, and that really, this has been a significant contribution. And I think we owe it to our future generations to show them good examples of how, by reflecting to the past, looking at how we can build the future. So this is important. We got to get our history right. I went to a history forum and there was Australian, ARC grant on oral history. And guess what? There were no mention of Muslim community in that book, and I was quite surprised because, as you know, Camelees had a huge impact. Now, I think this also has significance in impact, and it's not just about accurate national history, but the impact is greater than. It's the acknowledgement of contribution of minority communities. And what this will do by way of impact is actually empower minority communities and help to foster more active citizenship by these communities and ownership of our national history, which I think is important for a cohesive society as well. So my last bit would be for tertiary education research councils to further facilitate and promote, encourage histories of minorities as part of our national history and diverse history.
Yeah. John, can I ask?
Yes, sure, Mehmet.
Yes. So we know that ISRA, Islamic Science and Research Academy, delivers a classical Islamic sciences and study in a contemporary context. So apart from delivering Bachelor of Arts, what sort of courses do you offer at ISRA?
Yeah, we offer Islamic Studies, Bachelor of Islamic Studies. So we're actually lucky, a very unique institution that Muslims don't have to go overseas, now no longer possible. We're quite well equipped at SISAC to provide, from Charles Sturt University, to provide bachelor's, master's within the Islamic tradition, but of course also issues related to Islam, contemporary Islamic studies. And I'm the higher degrees research coordinator, so we're definitely open to postgraduate research and PhDs as well. So we do offer a range of courses. We also have the classical Arabic masters for those who want to dive deeper into that. But I'm interested more in Australian history, Muslim history, and of course Islamic spirituality.
Just finally, all of the great religious traditions we've spoken of have a civilizational element to them. They shape the nature of people's cultures and beliefs. There are interesting lessons, I think, being drawn from the pandemic. One is the balance between individual health and economic stability. Another is to do with the future of our own society. I mean, over the past 50 years, the West in particular has moved significantly in the direction of small government centred on individual freedom and material wealth. COVID seems to have opened up that debate again. It's highlighting the tensions between that view and a view that government must have a more active role if we are to maintain our social cohesion in the face of global challenges, not just Australian ones. At the heart of these values questions are ones that are historically shaped by religion. And it comes back to that point you made earlier. Are we sufficiently equipped for those discussions?
That's a big question, John, and thank you for asking. I think that though we have good examples in place to foster cohesive society, nevertheless, as we have seen through this pandemic, I believe we're a little ill-equipped, actually not ready to address these issues adequately. And I acknowledge, we heard the address from the Prime Minister, which really warmed up a lot of the Muslims, which is fantastic. And because these are very tough and testing times for administrators, and I'm sure they're doing their personal best to meet and address our national concerns. I think, however, we have a greater crisis beyond politics, economics, and government. And that is the pandemic highlighting to us that we are facing a moral and ethical dilemma as a human community in this current crisis, but they say there is opportunity in every calamity. So we need to, I think, take this opportunity despite the challenges. I know I also feel them as everybody else, I'm sure, but we need to reflect deeper into the meaning and the existential questions, as I said to you, that I have been trying to for myself, that face all of us. Like, where are we headed? Where are we all going? Can we continue? I know the key question is survival right now for all of us in the global scenario, and of course at a national level. I'm so happy to hear in South Australia doing well. I think we've got a lot of catching up to do in Sydney, in New South Wales. But how do we go about, how can we continue if we continue on the same mode of greed, personal ambition, with little disregard for others? Or can we work towards something else, which I think this is what you're talking about, allowing the compassion, the other, turning the cheek to the other, or, embracing a sustainable community for all. And I think, just last final words, we live as a human community today, but we also need to focus on the rehumanization. And I don't say that without, a mockery, because I really believe we're being stripped away from our basic core values as human beings. Because we need to stand up for selflessness as opposed to selfishness. And we saw this at the beginning of the pandemic, even in Australia, over the toilet paper wars. We need to focus on the we versus the me. We need to focus on an inclusive rather than separatist politics, swinging from the right to the left. We need the balance, which is what religion teaches us always, and Islam, of course. Beyond these, we need to overcome racism. I was so sad to hear that there's a rise and children are at risk, Asian children at risk of racism, and tertiary and other educational like mine are being warned about that. We cannot turn a blind eye to any form of bigotry, racism, greed, and of course exploitation of the weak. It's high time for a renewed commitment to humanity. We need a sustainable policy administration to cooperate internally as a nation, but also with other communities. We can't just think selfishly, even as a nation. We live in a global world. We just went through a bushfire disaster, climate, and now we face this pandemic as a nation. I know it's difficult. However, we can't just think no longer, I, myself alone. If my stomach is full, it's enough. We have to think collectively if we want humanity to survive. I think this is where religions can contribute and re-educate and reinstall these values within us. Sorry to take your time. Thank you.
Well, look, just to let you know, I wouldn't despair on this, the ability of the public to grasp this. There was a cartoon in the newspapers this morning, had two images. One, a sign that said, greed is good, and next to it another sign with a sign crossed out, and it said, "Greed is God." And I think that showed the sort of way in which even our cynical Australian eyes are asking some other questions. Mahsheed Ansari, thanks so much for joining us this evening.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you all. Thank you.
Well, Mehmet, that's just about all we have time for in today's program. Some very interesting questions.
Can I please add something?
Yeah, sure.
Yes. At the beginning, I was talking about community practices. As Adelaide, we also supported virtual Ramadan talks organized by Ahmet Keskin, Australian Intercultural Society. I think he's doing a great job. Having a friend, family friends, and others on the other end of online call or chat or video conference, conversation over a cup of tea. I think this is great. I think Mr. Ahmet Keskin, thank you for your thoughtful and innovative invitation to the wider community. Also, I think both Ahmets are doing a great job. Personally, maybe you too, John. You and Ahmet, we couldn't think or anticipate that Ramadan Conversations will be a huge success. So congratulations on a great success. Mr. Ahmet Polat, maybe I think he'll provide virtual biscuits with his cup of tea or cup of coffee.
Indeed, indeed. Mehmet, thank you so much for your contribution.
Yes, anytime. Thank you for the opportunity. I have really enjoyed, co-hosting this program with you, John.
Well, thank you all at home as well, or wherever you happen to be, for joining this Ramadan conversation. Our next episode will be tomorrow, and we'll have guests from Sydney, Melbourne, and even far off New Jersey. Over the past week, our conversations have featured a number of well-known guests, and if you wish to view this or any of this series of Ramadan Conversations once more, you can find them on the Affinity YouTube channel. Stay safe. Have a blessed Ramadan.